Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. This is part 2, or I guess maybe better said, Jason's segment, Jason's story.
Jason's story.
If you listened last week, we detailed a little bit about what my kind of faith journey was from, young childhood up into 18 years old. And so we're going to do that for Jason because some of you might not know his background and his history. And I'm excited to learn things that I didn't know before because I think, like Jason said last week, there are things he knew most of my story, but he learned new perspectives on that. And so pretty excited to see what God has for us in this. So, Jason, tell us a little bit about your faith journey.
So a big part started before I was born. My dad had a really strong Baptist family.
Go all the way back. In the beginning, God.
Oh, that far back. So anyways, there is this.
Sorry, I shouldn't have belittled that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Let's start. Or do you want to keep that?
Oh, we'll see.
Do what you want to do. So yeah, for me, it started before I was born. My dad came from a strong Baptist family, and I mean really strong. His brother's a Baptist pastor. And then my mom came from a strong Church of Christ family. They both, for a variety of reasons, were really wanting to get out of the house, wanting to get build their own life, and they found each other at a pretty vulnerable time. But a prerequisite for them getting married was my dad becoming a member of the Church of Christ, which he did. And so I was born into a dynamic that my dad had to leave a lot to become a member of the Church of Christ. And so we very much framed our connection with God as more who we were against than who we were with. And that really affected it. And the Church of Christ that we were a part of, they were loving people, everyone, but well, not everyone maybe, but most of them. But that was there. It's like we're the ones going to heaven, and Churches of Christ, if you don't know this, are autonomous. We don't have a board that kind of makes us work together as a larger group. And so, yeah, most of my childhood was like that. My parents ended up getting divorced after having a pretty rough marriage. When I was 10, my mom then a couple years later married another preacher who was a member of the Church of Christ. Yeah, my dad was a preacher. I didn't say that, I guess. And so I spent a lot of time moving around. We moved around a lot. And in several different states. And so by the time I graduated high school, I was very done with church. I felt it was a necessary evil. And that doesn't mean the people were bad. It's just the process was not life-giving. And I didn't even know enough to say it that clearly. I went to a year at a Christian school, and that was pretty disillusioning. And I was not interested in the Christ part of things. I was in the Army a few years, and in the Army I met a guy that really was Christ to me. He wasn't in the Army. He was at a church because I did attend some, so I didn't have to lie to my parents all the time about everything. But his name is Charles Smith. But Charles made a huge impact in my life, and that kind of set me on the course. I ended up going to the Adventures in Missions program, a 2-year mission program. Spent almost a couple years in Ecuador in South America, and so I really loved God. So throughout my time getting my education, I actually worked with that same missions program because I liked the process. And then at about 20 years ago, nearly, I got a call from a guy that was in Tulsa and said, "Hey, we'd like you to be a minister. We'd like you to put in a resume to be a minister." And I thought that was crazy, but God really worked on me for about 6 months. And I took that job, and I've been at that job ever since. And that job has changed in terms of my role, but I love the people at that church. And so I'm in a funny way because on one hand, I'm a minister, clearly, and it's what I was wired to do by God, I believe. But I have no interest in, like, if I didn't have this job, I wouldn't look for a ministry job, you know. I would still do ministry, but I wouldn't. It's really focused on the church I'm part of. It's tough at times, like any place, but it's just a beautiful, beautiful place to be.
Thank you, Jason. So I want to back up kind of to maybe your childhood and maybe early teenage years. I'm really fascinated by the dynamic of the churches that you grew up in. The very for some people, sadly for a lot of people, the very common idea of, hey, we're the ones who are saved and the ones who are outside of these walls are not saved. And I was lucky enough to not grow up in a church like that, but I knew of churches like that. And because I grew up in a Church of Christ, there were many people who thought that was that I was one of those people that, ironically, I was one of the people that was shutting people out, and so people shut me out because they thought I was one, which is just a whole funny thing.
So human.
But what an interesting thing for me is you talked about church being kind of a necessary evil as you kind of entered into adulthood. But before that, as you kind of came into your own as a person, what was your perception of Jesus? Because you had all these church folk, right, that you really struggle with in the whole organization of itself. So what was your actual perception of the person of Jesus?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny. I would say I had no perception of Jesus. In some ways, Jesus was not the centerpiece of our emphasis. Now, if I said that to the people, they'd be like, no, we're a Church of Christ. But we were much more focused on our organizational rules and keeping those rules and serving. There's a lot of serving and, helping people, with their rent and things like this. But very much in terms of what we talked about, it was mostly the rules. It was mostly, have you been keeping this rule? Here's a better way to keep this rule, that kind of thing. And so Jesus was very vague to me. Matter of fact, I can remember when I was in high school, somebody came to our church visiting and really emphasized it's about the relationship with Jesus. And that person was looked at like, that ain't right. It's just not right. Because when you say it's all about the relationship with Jesus, people would immediately be defensive about, wait a minute, you're saying the rules aren't important. And it's just, it created this weird dynamic that you were encouraged not to connect with Jesus as the person, or really even as the Savior, but only as the rule giver.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of sounds like your relationship with Jesus didn't really get kick-started until the guy in when you were in the military who introduced you to Jesus. And so I wonder, was there ever that draw because he was being Jesus to you? Did you ever have a draw back to what you saw growing up? In other words, like when you really came to know Jesus and have a real relationship with him, was there ever a drift back to, even though you didn't like it, was there ever a drift back to, well, this is what I saw because these other people claim Jesus and now I'm claiming Jesus? Does that make sense?
I think so. Let me give you a little bit.
Interviewer.
You tell me.
Yeah,
no, you're doing great. So because I've seen this in other people, like they don't come to church and they love to connect at Memorial because of, we're much more grace centered and really first, the rules are always important. We all have rules in our relationship, but it has to be in the right order, a relationship that leads to wanting to fulfill these things. And I see people come in and they haven't been in church at all and they love the grace, but then when they think a rule is broken, they're ready to end the relationship. And I was somewhat like that. Matter of fact, I have been at places that are big gatherings, and I would see something I didn't like, and I would go outside in like the foyer areas, and I would talk it up with people. What was going on inside was wrong. So I was the very thing I hated in those moments, because it takes a while to learn. It's like anything. If you learn to do something wrong and then don't do it forever, and then you come back to doing it, even if you know it was wrong, your muscle memory will take over at first. And it takes you a while to grow into that. But absolutely, you always have these, vestiges of who you were before. And the way you get over those is you keep practicing, you keep working through it, keep letting God heal you of those things and show you something new.
So that kind of leads to my next question. We've talked a lot through the pod, we've talked a lot in our relationship and certainly on the podcast about some of the things that you've left behind, some of the rules based things, some of the legalism that you grew up in, and so my next question is what's a good thing that you kind of hold on to? What's a good thing that you can look back when you were attending church or you were part of a church when you were younger that you go, man, that was good, that was of God, and I value that to this day?
Certainly, I was part of almost exclusively smaller churches, 150 or less, and there was such family. I mean, now the challenge with it is you're either way family or you're not family at all, But when you were family, a lot of sacrificial nature, a lot of service, a lot of missional, and by missional I mean awareness that people need this. Now they might have been overemphasizing some of the wrong things, but the spirit of we all need to be saved was really strong. There was a deep respect for the Bible. Now I would say we all can say I respect the Bible, and really what we're saying is I respect my interpretation of the Bible. But there was a call to the Bible needs to make these decisions. This is not a feeling-based decision process, though we need to account for our feelings. But it is a belief in that God's sovereignty. It was a big deal in the Churches of Christ I was part of, and the idea of being attentive to your commitments. That idea of I made a commitment to this church, and when it's hard, I'm going to stay with it, and do my best to, and not perceive myself as a spectator, but I am part of this. So a real family-centric dynamic, and that's what makes the negative parts bad, is because when you taste the good and then all of a sudden you're on the outside of that, it's so much more hurtful. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of good there in my heritage.
Interesting. Transitioning a little bit, you spent a few years or a couple years, right, in Ecuador. Is that correct? Okay, cool.
Yes.
So what would you say? So we're recording right now from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Like you said, you've been employed in a church in Tulsa, Oklahoma now for 16, 17, however long.
18 years.
18 years. Oh, man, one more.
18 years, 3 months, 14 days, 6 hours. I'm not counting.
Yeah, it's clear that you're so happy. No, I'm just kidding. You're a very happy person. In fact, I think I would know. That's one of the fascinating things about Jason, about you, Jason. I'm talking to a crowd here, but you're face to face with me. Is like there are many times where I've sat down with you, and like if you didn't say like I'm incredibly depressed right now, or I'm really down, really sad, like your countenance would not have like told me that. And so, which is a very fascinating thing, and man, it leads credence to your your humility and your leadership, that like you could probably get away. Most people would not know that you were struggling the way you struggle sometimes. And so I always really appreciate that about you. So going back to the question that I never got to about your time in Ecuador, that is a completely different culture than the culture you find yourself now in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I imagine it's completely different than the culture you grew up in, and then in Lubbock, Texas. And so how has that shaped you? Like, what are some things that in your walk with God, that whether it's a time, experience, or memory or practice that you really draw upon from that time you spent abroad?
That's a great question. And the reason that you do missions is always at least twofold, but the bigger part is how God teaches you and trains you. You're there to serve and love and provide truth as best you can, but really it's how it shapes you when you do, whether it's a week or a year or however long you're there. For me, it really fell in a place. I just spent a few years in the Army, and so I'd learned some independence. I had a lot of fear. I mean, I still struggle with fear, but I had an enormous amount of fear. And so being in Ecuador, it was like a fresh start. I was there. Like when I speak Spanish, I think of Jesus. Because I learned it to talk about Jesus, and I became very well versed in Jesus language. But if you get outside of that, like you start talking about something else, I'm like, I don't understand any words you're saying, kind of thing, which isn't true, but I mean, it did feel that way. So it was very much a restart for my life. So that deeply affects it.
Oh man, that's really fascinating. So would you say that when you speak Spanish confidently, it's in the context of Jesus? So what is that like for your relationship with a language, for the confidence of that practice, of that thing to be solely based in Jesus? Does that have, I'm just trying to like kind of, I've never even considered this as a possibility before. Is that anything like, is there anything interesting or different about that for you? The fact that like your English language, maybe for you it's like, Marvel Comics. That's the context that you feel super confident in, or whatever.
So true.
But yeah, that's really fascinating. I never even considered a whole language being where you would find confidence. In
right.
Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it is interesting. I will say this: when I find somebody and I'm speaking Spanish to them now, here in the United States, I will be twice as likely to think about God and what does God want with this, interaction. Why might God have me talking to this person other than whatever our stated business might be? It does affect you. And I think in general, in perspective, if you do it right, you perceive yourself as I'm the learner here in all situations. When you, especially going into, I would say for every situation, but certainly into a foreign country where you're wanting to learn. And so not just language, but everything was through that lens of how can I love people? And whereas in English, I've done so many things where it was not based on that, that whole experience started to reframe my life. It's like I had this time, this 2 years, to solely think, and this is the benefit of the way if I had been there as a missionary, and especially if I had a family, I would have all these things to contend with. But to be able to go as a single person and solely every day, and I had other things I did, of course, but that was the main focus: is how do I love people like Christ in this situation? It really reoriented me. The other thing is your priorities shift. You realize that Jesus didn't come to earth just to save America. And I mean, that's such a silly thing to have to say, but I do think you become so central. Well, it's whatever. If you were in Nairobi and you were a Christian there'd be a sense of God first and foremost came for the people of Nairobi.
Yeah, I'm sure Peter thought that.
Exactly right. I mean, that is a perfect example. And so it was good to be out and say, wait a minute, and then you start to see how God shows up different in that culture, that's superior to other cultures, including my experience in the United States. And so, man, their definition of family in South America, and oh my goodness, they're not being worried about privacy. Oh my goodness. It was just crazy in my mind sometimes, the way they would live together as families and extended families, but so beautiful. And something I'm like, I've never seen this in my whole life, and certainly in my family, where there's so much fragmenting, and I see in the American United States families, and I just think so. Yeah, there's a lot of things, but the overall thing is just in general seeing that when you see God in another culture, and you could accomplish this in the United States. I spent a month spending time with people in the deaf community, and I saw God differently after spending time with people in the deaf community, because he was still God, but the aspects of him that really resonated with them were different than the hearing world. And I think you could do that with any culture. Of seeing it through that lens will show you God in a totally different way. And that's where it was, but it became very personal. So from Charles on to this experience, even more than the training I received to prep for that experience, but just that idea of seeing God in that way, totally life-changing.
Do you have a particular moment, story, encounter with God, or any sort of maybe visceral moment that you just that you hold on to from 20 to 30 years ago or from 5 months ago, that you just go, man, God showed up in such a real way that the memory of it is still vivid in my mind. The colors are more vibrant. The words seem more poignant the longer I think about them. Do you have a story or moment like that in your life?
I do. It was actually in Ecuador. And I've had many, but this is the one that I immediately jumped to. I was studying something. I was reading the Bible, and in one of the apartments we lived in, we were on like the 7th or 8th floor. And Quito, the capital city there, is in a valley, and it's extremely green. Like if maybe Oregon would be that green, or Washington State, but I mean, Tulsa, we call ourselves green country, and compared to Lubbock, Texas, where I lived, it is very green country. But it was just beautiful. It was just beautiful. Yeah. You're surrounded by mountains. And so I'm sitting there studying, and I don't know exactly what kind of coalesced there to make me think about this, but all of a sudden it hit me, I am the most privileged person in the world here. And all my life I've only been, and kind of I was taught this, to focus on what you don't have. And it's funny how we say this, where we say something on steroids is better when we know in real life on steroids is worse. But it was like count your blessings on steroids. It hit me like a sledgehammer. It was just so beautiful, but also painful to realize I was in a constant process of squandering my blessings because I perpetually focused on what I didn't have. And it was a freedom. So I mean, I was just washed over by gratefulness to God. I was washed over by guilt, but I immediately accepted his grace and forgiveness over that, and really felt like this is the freshest of the fresh start. And I feel that way a lot now. It's become muscle memory to me because of that situation. But that was the first time it hit me. I'm the most privileged person in the universe. And Terry Rush, one of our preachers at Memorial, he would say that all the time. He'd be like, I'm the luckiest man alive. And I just think, man, that changes the way you deal with everything. Because most of the things that offend me would look very, very small in comparison to how blessed I am.
If I gave you the opportunity to speak into the life of all the Christians in the world, or all the Christians in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or whatever the distinction you want to make, and really hone in on one specific thing, one specific issue, one specific philosophy, and help disciple a large group of people in the singular issue, what would that be?
So I've if I had more time to think, I'd be able to focus it more. But here's the spirit of it. In every moment, you have the choice. Do you want to get what you want right now, or do you want to impact eternity? And those are not – you could accomplish both. It just depends on what you want right now. But that idea of impacting eternity, one of the things Charles taught me years and years ago, I wasn't married. I didn't know, who my wife was going to be yet. But he said when he comes home, he will stop, because you're coming home from work and he worked hard and he was mad or sad or happy or whatever. But when he come home from work, he would stop on the porch right before he walked into his house, and he would say, "This is my altar," and this is drawing from Romans 12, where you sacrifice yourself, But he said, "This is my altar. I'm sacrificing myself, and I will go in my house and love my wife and my daughters, because that impacts eternity." Other than I want my food, I want my rest, I want my hobby, I want my attention, my affection, whatever that is. And that has helped me so much, that when you're in the moment, do I want to impact eternity, or do I just want what I want right now? And understand, the way that's lived out is billions of possibilities. But the key is to frame your mind, to bring God into that moment and think about this. Because if I'm thinking that way and somebody's irritating to me, I have more patience. If I'm thinking that way and somebody I feel like is pushing on me and offended, I will have more stamina, to take it. Because now I see this as not just a moment in time, an interruption to my schedule, whatever. You're just a step in the process for my success to get whatever I want done today. But it adds meaning. And then all that scripture I have in my head comes to mind, and I'm just asking God, what truth needs to be here? How does Jesus need to show up? What's the most loving thing I can do? And those aren't exactly the same, but it's like the different facet of that. But my key is I need a trigger that's strong enough to motivate me to bring God into the picture. I think the biggest problem Christians have is this disconnect between the ideals that they have with them and God and living their what we call our normal everyday life. And I think church sometimes helps in that separation, because you have to act this certain way in this building, in this magic hour, in this magic room, but outside, who cares how that goes, kind of thing. And because we spend so much time honing in on that hour.
Sure.
But I think that helps me bring it into the here and now all the time.
Oh man, that's really good. That just pops up 1,000 different things in my mind. So I think both you and I are very familiar with this idea and the phenomenon of like, okay, I'm giving this time, whether it's the church time or the time I spend planning for a class or a sermon, or that I'm meeting somebody for coffee. This is God's time, and then I get home and I have my time, and that happens to be whenever. And I am just as guilty as anybody. But I've really noticed since my daughter has been born that's been slowly taken away from me, and sometimes it's frustrating and sometimes it's a good thing, because usually I try to be as selfless as I can with those things. So, okay, I'm going to work, and if there's an opportunity that I can speak to somebody and encourage them, if there's an opportunity I can love somebody, that's great, that's fantastic. When I come home, I want to be a servant to this is how things have always been. I want to be a servant to my wife, to any friends that call, anything that God puts in front of me, I'm gonna do it. Then after everybody goes to sleep, I can play video games. I can have my time. I can really hone in on on my life and kind of take back control. And there's been it's been really fascinating because I've never had this experience before where like I can do all of that. I can sort my life. I can schedule it all through, and then I can get to my time. Everyone's asleep. And then a 4-week-old starts bawling, and I have to drop everything and have to be completely selfless for this completely dependent little human animal child. And it's a
This is why I tell Hannah never to listen to these.
well, she won't ever listen to that, so she won't ever hear the joke. So no, but it has been really convicting for me because I think because I realize so much, I want to avoid, just having the church be my God time. So I try to make, work be some God time and my time with my wife be some God time. I realized that I was actually carving out some time for myself. And that's not a bad thing. Playing games is not a bad thing. But I was treating it as like, okay, finally I can, this is mine. This is, nobody else's. Like, God's not even entering into the picture here. And my baby, through crying and pooping diapers, just came in with a wrecking ball, which is, I'm just imagining a baby. If you saw the Miley Cyrus wrecking ball video, I'm just imagining a baby in a diaper on a wrecking ball swinging in. So Jason,
wait, I need to say I have no idea what you're referencing with Miley Cyrus. That Jason, may or may not be true.
Oh gosh!
Hey, real quick, I want to say
lied on the podcast.
I want to say this. This is really important. Two things. Number one, you're trading something that has value to you, i.e. playing games, having your time, with something that ultimately has more value. So this is tapping into that very dynamic of looking towards eternity, to more. And here's what's really, really important to this. We create the divide. This is me focusing on God. This is me playing a video game. And because we think God sees that as secular. But the things that were commonplace, that were secular in Jesus' world, he references and adds God to. He puts God in. So I'm saying if your thing is to watch TV, there's nothing better than free stories. I mean, I love free stories, that are well told and well presented. Do that with God. There's nothing better, and the video game, nothing better than the creativity you can see in video games. Now, might that change the way you think about that? But we have to keep trading this image of God's primarily here to judge us. 2, God is primarily here to grow us, and he'll use anything that's in our world to grow us. So this is the dynamic of saying he's still sovereign God, but he enters into the minutia of our life. And if you think differently, I would encourage you, read the Gospels, that he is working in that minutia and he's taking simple things. They didn't look at men farming as, that's the godliest thing. This is a necessity. They had to do it. Fishing is it's so godly to be fishing. It's like, not any more than anything else, it's, are you leaving God? So there's no contrast in saying you do need time alone and to refuel, and you do need time, I think, to be distracted. God, I think, wired us in this way. It's simply of starting and if you can't even imagine, how would I do it? Now, if we're talking about, hey, I'm going to do this known sin, I'm like, yeah, you need to bring God there too to help you not do that known sin. But what is it that's stirring in you that you're answering with sin that he could answer in a better way? And I think that's that important thing is we've got to think, if I have something bad in my life, I don't just want to focus on eliminating that. And this goes to the where Jesus is telling that parable. I'm saying it's a parable where you sweep out your house of a demon, and then if you just have it empty, it's going to come back. We've got to think of, okay, God, we've got to ask, what can fill this to meet this need? Because we do these things for a need. Is there a better way to do that?
No, that's good. That's really good. So, what about your walk with Jesus as it currently stands amazes you?
Yeah, I am 100% amazed every day that I get to live the life I'm living. I really am fully convinced that God uses me to impact eternity, and that is I know how I am undeserving of that role. And that amazes me, that he would work through me in that way. And I know full well not my sinfulness of yesterday, my sinfulness of today, and what I've struggled with for years, that he sees that too, and he is forgiving that and healing that and working on that. But he would use me to do that. That's staggering. And the thought, when I speak to somebody, I know that about them too. That God, if they are tuning into God even a little bit, even a mustard seed, God is using them to impact eternity, and I get to participate in that in just a little way.
That's awesome. So what what is perplexing you right now?
It's very perplexing to me to take all that I know about the Word of God and try to figure out how it meets the needs of today. So we spent years in the Churches of Christ arguing, and in some circles they still do, about how should we worship? Should we use instruments? Should we sing in a cappella? Should we have women say or do this or not? How do we dress in these situations? A lot of energy into that. And one of my tensions with that, and we've been talking about this at Memorial for over a decade, is, look, we've got to come to some conclusion here because we're going to be facing issues we've never imagined. And I thought it was going to be cloning, and I think it still will be. Like, what happens when a clone person shows up? Do they have a soul? And how do we do this? How do we sort that out? But the idea, I feel like most Christians are totally inept, including me to some degree, of how do I reach to somebody with a lifestyle that I see from my vantage point, see it as very sinful, and yet how do I love them well? Like, how would Jesus work in that? And that's the most perplexing thing, is knowing Jesus would do it exceptionally well and feeling a burden of knowing I don't. And so how can I be more like Jesus, that he 100% held to truth, and yet he was with people that were drinking for the point of drunkenness. That's the way the people are saying. When they say to Jesus, the people say, hey, you're a drunkard. He was hanging around with people that were prostitutes, not they'd given up their prostitution, and he was able to love them so well, he changed their whole entire world. And I'm like, so how can Jesus work through me to change their entire world, even when I can't figure out how to make things congruent?
Oh, that's good.
And so it's. I don't think I'll ever be unperplexed by it. But when he opens up a little key, hey, Jason, I want you to see this, it gives me so much hope that if we are learners, he can teach us how to do this.
Sure. Man, that's so good. I think, just real quick for me, one of the things that's always been really helpful on that side of things, and not to dive too deep into it, but it is reminding myself over and over again that if I'm looking at somebody or a situation or an issue and I'm going, man, that's how, like, that issue is so complicated, this person has so much trauma and so many issues, and how do I love them like Jesus? And Jesus would have done it perfectly, but I don't feel equipped to do it. Reminding myself that somebody could have and probably did look at me and say the same thing. Looking at me as, as a broken and desperate need of a father, like I talked about last week, at 16, 17 years old, just with a lot of baggage and a lot of issues, somebody would have looked at me and said the same exact thing. And that doesn't solve all the issues, but it is a helpful reminder of, like, hey, if God did it for you, then he can certainly do it for these people or that person or whoever.
That is so true. There's not only Charles, God reached me through several people when I was in the Army, but one was this lieutenant who wasn't in our platoon. He was in our troop. But I was one of the only people, think about that, 200 soldiers that went to church on a Sunday morning when I did go. And so he found that out, and I was really upset because he started to say, hey, I heard you're a Christian. I'm like, yeah. And he was a lieutenant, so I kind of had to, so he'd be like, we should get lunch. And I'm like, all right. And I was always thinking, how do I get out of this, And because you had that power differential, although he never referenced it.
Christians and their coffees and lunches.
I know,
gosh.
But he was so kind, so kind. And he had been part of a Church of Christ and had left it, and I think a very legalistic part. And so he was trying to help me see there was something better, And the last time I saw him, as far as he knew, I was as bad as the first time I saw him. Mm-hmm. And I've looked for him, online. So if Andrew Clanton, if you were Andrew Clanton.
What a name for a military man. That is, like, Clanton just sounds like it's like the perfect military name.
But, I mean, he was tremendous. Like, they always, when they got to ranges to qualify, there'd be, cases of beer on the line. And so when he'd win, people knew he because of Christ, he didn't drink. So I respected him and wanted him never to speak to me. And the worst thing is, we'd be walking casually. I'd be with soldiers, and he'd be like, hey, how you doing, Thornton? And I'd be like, sir, I'm doing good. And he'd be like, how's your walk with Jesus? And I'm like, oh, I think I'm having a heart attack, or anything that could take me out of this conversation. And I'm like, I can't tell him thank you. But as far as he knows, I'm an example of somebody that claims Christ, he was grace-filled. I'm not saying he had judgment against me, But yeah, when I run into a situation, I'm like, man, what could God do
For him,
here?
he probably felt like he's hitting brick wall after brick wall, and he just kept showing up and kept doing these things. And
yeah, and he has no idea the impact that made on my life.
That's awesome. So, kind of wrapping up here, do you have a passage, a verse, a story in the Bible that is really spoken to you throughout your life or recently?
Yeah, I would say that it's two, but they're right together. They're actually far apart in the history, but they're right together in concept. Mm-hmm. When Jesus is in the boat and he tells Peter to go fishing, and Peter's like, okay, I'll comply, but this is stupid. He sees the miracle and he immediately tries to make sense of it, and he's like, you need to get away from me because you're holy and I'm not. And Jesus says, come and make me fishers of men. I love that because Peter had no clue what he was getting into. None. He just knew something amazing happened, and this really godly person was going to call him into that. And I'll tell you, this is my Karate Kid deal. When I saw Karate Kid, the thing that I wanted most, I want a Miyagi. I want somebody that's not going to be put off by my stupidity and my weakness and my insecurity and just going to train me up. But I remember it was so deep, like 10 years later, I was telling Heather, my wife, I was like, man, I just need a Miyagi in this, and realizing that's what Peter needed, and Jesus was his Miyagi. Then you jump to when Jesus is about to go and say, go into all the world, and he's going to ascend, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, where some were doubting. I think it's probably pretty possible that Peter is one of them. And that idea, what more can Jesus do? And yet Jesus doesn't turn him away. He empowers him. He takes him in all of his insecurity. And I love that. I love that concept that no matter what God has done for me, I'm still going to be insecure about the next thing, and that doesn't deter Jesus from working with me. My whole success is I choose to show up, and I choose to participate and let him lead me.
That's awesome. Do you have anything else you want to...
No, it's just I wish, part of my burden on my heart sometimes is I wish I could go back and connect with all the people in these churches and tell them how good they are and how beautiful they are. And to those that are still stuck in that mentality that they've got to get to a certain place before they can feel safe with Jesus, I'm like, man, that is the devil's distortion. And I hope, I'm not the only tool in the shed. Obviously, God has millions of ways to get to people, but I hope that's their reality today.
Thank you for listening. This was kind of a fun thing for Jason and I to record both of our episodes. And if this was something that you enjoyed hearing, please let us know. Or if it was terrible and you're like, please don't ever talk about your personal lives this in depth again, let us know that too. Be kind about it and filter those through Jason, and I'll let him, determine how much my little delicate heart can take. And remember, I just had a baby, and so I'm very, very emotional. And so, yeah, grace,
poor man.
Grace, peace, and love.